Good morning. My name is Zach Anderson. I'm an MFA student here, and we are in the Zamora Library at the Institute for Latino Studies for our oral history interview project. I'm here today with Cynthia Cruz, the author of 4 collections of poetry, Ruin, The Glimmering Room, Wunderkammer, and How the End Begins. Her essays, interviews, and art writings have been published in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the American Poetry Review, Guernica, and Hyperallergic. She has received fellowships from Yaddo and the MacDowell Colony, as well as a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton University. She has an MFA from Sarah Lawrence in writing, and an MFA in art criticism and writing from the School of Visual Arts. She is currently pursuing a PhD in Germanic languages and literature at Rutgers and teaches at Sarah Lawrence. So Cynthia, welcome.
Thank you.
We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I was thinking that just to start with, we could hear a little bit about just your background. We ask all our authors to state where you were born, date of birth, and then maybe if you could just sort of sketch out how you got to this point.
Okay. So I was born in Wiesbaden, Germany, West Germany. It was an Air Force base. My father was in the military 20 years. And he met my mom there. That's why I was born there. And my birthday is January 27, 1968. And how I got here? It's a long story. Maybe, let me think. So my dad, his parents came from Chihuahua, Mexico, and he's not entirely sure how they came up or exactly where they're from. There are no records. There's no records. I've looked, and there are no records of their births. That's pretty typical. But they did come all the way up to Wyoming, and actually he grew up in Fort Laramie, I think, and worked on a field there until he was, I think, 15, and then he ran away from home, and he lied and joined the Air Force. He said he was older than he was, and for him that was the only, he wasn't like interested necessarily in war. It was the only option for him to get a job, and he stayed with the military 20 years, and then, like I said, he met my mom, and then they came to California, and I was raised in Northern California in many different places. My dad had a bunch of different jobs, and we traveled a lot. We moved a lot, moved around a lot, and that's up to that. I was the first in my family to go to college. My dad, because of his being Mexican-American, he was not able to finish grammar school. But I did finish high school, and then after a couple years, I went to community college, and then I eventually transferred to Mills College, and then I went to grad school. So everything's, I was thinking when you read my bio, that it's very accelerated later. It gets very accelerated, but it's because I'm very aware of the fact that I feel like I'm catching up on time, in so many of the years of my life where I think one of the things I think about a lot is the fact that though I don't look Mexican for a lot of people because I'm half German, and my father's family is half Spanish, half Mexican Indian. The legacy of the class and the race affect me, so that I didn't know how to get into college. Once I was in college, I didn't know how to behave. I didn't know how to study. So everything that I've done has been sort of self-taught, trying to figure out what I should do next, and not knowing what I don't know has been difficult too. So realizing I don't know this, and then I didn't know I could get a PhD, which is why I'm doing it now. And then I was thinking, I feel like I should let you ask me another question. I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, I was wondering if you might sort of trace this progression, since we're talking about your grad school years,
Yeah.
as it were,
Yeah.
like the progression from sort of creative writing to art
Okay,
criticism
that's good.
to your new project.
Right, right. So, so after grad school, I started adjuncting, and that's what I did for many years.
Mhm.
And I was a poet, and that's entirely what I did. And I think I started to realize that there were experiences I was having that I didn't have the vocabulary for, and that I think became more clearer when I would look at artwork and I didn't know what to say about it. So I would have a feeling, but I didn't know how to articulate it. And so it made sense to me to go study art writing so I could start to figure out what it was. And actually I went in to figure out how to write about abstract art, and I don't know how to. The thing about abstract art is that it's abstract, right? So it's funny, some things there really are not, there's no way to really talk about. But what happened when I was there is I enjoyed my my studying at SVA so much. I kept asking the chair of the department, like, can't we just stay longer? Can't we just make a PhD out of this? And he said, no, of course not. But I realized at a certain point that almost all the people I was writing about, they were all German writers, so Walter Benjamin or Abbe Warburg or Ingeborg Bachmann, or they were German painters, contemporary German painters. And so it made sense to study German. I also was very interested in writers and artists who use silence in their work, and I wrote my thesis on Margaret Duras, Ingeborg Bachmann, Hannah Darboven, and Clarice Lispector, and how they use silence in their work as a kind of refusal. And so that's why I decided to get a PhD. So I knew that I still didn't have the language or vocabulary to discuss what I wanted to talk about. It was just I had just sort of realized that, and that's kind of what I was saying before, is that I'm coming to all these things late because I realized this stuff late, and then I think, oh, well, I can do this now, and I didn't have it before. I think I was just surviving so much before. So that's what I'm really interested in now.
Yeah, absolutely. I liked what you were saying about, or this feeling of catching up or of acceleration, maybe. And I was wondering about sort of the spaces between your books. So there's 6 years between Ruin and The Glimmering Room,
right.
and then after that, sort of these 2-year intervals, and
Right.
2 books forthcoming.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So is
Yeah.
that part of that, just acceleration?
Yeah, so it's funny. I think that, trying to think what happened. The Glimmering Room was actually 2 books. It was 2 different books, and Fourway said that they would publish it as 1, so it's actually 2.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that one thing's for sure is it isn't an idea. I didn't think to myself, I need to write as much as possible. It just sort of happened. But I'm trying to figure this out. For Wunderkammer, that was when I had the Princeton Fellowship. So I had a whole year, and that is the only book that I've written sort of conceptually, where I had this idea about the archive and clutter and trauma, and then wrote these poems based on that. But I think the thing honestly is that my natural state is to be writing. And so that's just sort of the way it is it many of the poems I'm just looking at how the end begins, were poems that I wrote while traveling or on the subway or out and about, and so they're they just sort of came to be in a way. But also I was thinking about just the pile of the books, and then there's more books coming, and I think that there's also this thing sort of in the back of my mind that I have to leave an archive. And so the other thing too is that the books come from my own experience, but they also come from my experience of what I see in this culture and other people's experiences. And so it's a way of taking that down and in a way archiving it. And I feel like because I'm the only one doing that for, there are many people I know who do not talk or write or anything, and then also my family, it seems important to leave this. That makes any sense, to leave this as a kind of archive.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like there might be a political valence there, like in terms of a counter archive or a.
Right, because the more books that there are, right, the more, I don't know, the more gravity in a way. The other thing I realized when I was in graduate school, I would go to St. Mark's Books, which is a great bookstore. I think it's closed now, but in the poetry section, and it was quite a vast poetry section. And the names, like my name, Cruz, I mean, I think there may be 3. I went through and I saw like there were no other names of Latin American poets or Latina poets. So just even, I'm aware that even just having a book with the last name Cruz is going to help other people when they go through the book and see that they think there's somebody who is somehow from the same world as me. It's not entirely like that, but in a small way it's like that.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking a little bit before about continuity, continuity across books and how you feel that they might be, that they are interconnected in some way. I was just wondering how you thought about that concept of continuity. I was thinking, personally, I see lines of thought in terms of like girlhood, childhood, power, trauma, the swoon or silences as resistance, as you were saying. Were there any movements that you want to trace across books, or did you feel, as you were writing each one, did they feel like distinct units?
They all felt distinct, and I think I said actually in an interview the other day, I answered the question that I really, with each book, I really am trying to do something entirely different. So the first book really was on this idea of the domestic in California, and the second book was about American culture and where we're at sort of politically. Wunderkammer was about trauma, and this last one is maybe sort of like the second one, but maybe a little darker, I think. But each one tries to be different, and I think also I try to write in a different form, trying different things, but they all talk about the same thing. And even the next book coming out is called Dregs, and or even this book here, I don't know if the word ruin is in it, it might be, but that idea of the end is imminent, it goes right back to the first book, but the first book was smaller, so the first book really is about how culture and the way that things are right now affect the family, and then the trauma is the same thing. That's talking about the different ways that the political affect people personally. So they all speak to each other, but it's almost like it's like nesting dolls in a way, like it's smaller, bigger, bigger, bigger. But the thing I was thinking about too is that how it's funny in the American poetry world how writing about class, or I think is class, or the way that culture affects one, writing about homelessness or things like that, are taken as a personal. And I was thinking about how that's an interesting change that happened in the culture, because it's actually political. It's something that's happening to many people rather than just one person, if that makes any sense. So I think that's interesting that people generally read the work as if it's my own personal experience rather than me talking about what's actually happening in the culture, and that it's political.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something that I was thinking about as well, just wondering how the term confessional strikes you, and if that's
Right.
I'm sure that term lands on your work from time to time, and just wondering like if that's still a useful way of thinking about anything, or if that's just misreading something.
Right. I think that so that's definitely a word that people use negatively, right?
Yeah.
And I think, when I use that word ever with my students, they all, like, everyone just screams, like nobody wants that to be them. But I think the push against that is really this the idea of the death of the author, which is really interesting, but it presumes that the author is white and privileged. So it's an interesting sort of circle. So if you're someone who's writing about, growing up poor, or a person of color, or a woman, or writing about gender, or any of that stuff, to write about that is not a choice. That's the only thing that you're thinking about, I imagine, right? So that is, in that way, it's confessional. And then to have the choice to not have to write about that is really a luxury. So that's something I think about a lot, and I try to push against that. I think that my work would be, actually I think it'd be much more popular if I didn't write from an I, but I'm not willing to do that. I think that's also sort of a political decision to do that, because then I'm saying everything's fine, and actually everything is not fine in our culture.
Yeah. I think that the I itself is really interesting in how I perceive it in your work, in that sometimes it seems very, very present and very sort of contextualized, gendered, etc. Whereas other times, like, there are poems that drop the I, or the I is sort of implied,
Right.
and we just get the verbs that imply that I.
Right, I think
Yeah.
that's really interesting, and I think it's true, because the thing is there are experiences in the books that are my experiences, but then there are experiences in the book that belong to people who I know, and so I think that's part of that, is this fluidity. And the other thing I realized, I was trying to find examples of it, but I couldn't remember where they were, is that the I also changes gender and changes point of view throughout, and I think that again is just I don't think it was something I thought conceptually, but it is this idea then that we are all, like, I'm everybody, we're all these different experiences, and I don't know, that's a whole other topic, I think, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to say that I am not interested in poems that actually say exactly what happened, right? These poems that are part of my training in the program I was in was basically a cup is a cup, and I don't believe a cup is a cup. A cup is also other things. But then it's also not true that a cup is not a cup. I mean, it's also true that that I live in the United States, and that we're at war in like 7 different countries, and all this stuff is true. And so in my work, I'm trying to find some place between that, where it's not completely absolving myself and not taking responsibility, but then it's also not just poems that are saying, because I can write essays. I write essays about this other stuff. So trying to find an in-between, I think that explains a little bit of the pivoting I, sort of, a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a quotation from Aileen Sizou from one of your other interviews, where she says, it's not about confessing oneself, but she talks about audaciousness, which consists in saying the worst and writing the worst and making it apparent. And in some ways, I was wondering if maybe this, using the I as in these different ways, has something to do with, like, sometimes the I feels very reflective, like maybe it's more about, like, making those things apparent that you were mentioning.
Right. And I really love that quote, because the idea of the confession is the idea of saying something and feeling better about it after. And the other thing is much more risky, which is saying something that you know that you're actually going to look worse if you do it, right? And I think that's a great risk, and that's something I'm interested in. And the other thing I think is that the idea of the archive and the way that one can write and I guess witness what's happening and put things in. One thing I'm really interested in is writing, especially in the Glimmering Room, actually putting things of the world in the poems. And I'm just always surprised when I go to the poetry section and open up books, and it's as if the books are not written in this world, right? The things of the world that's where I live. And so to have that stuff, or whatever, homelessness or poverty or all that stuff in the poems is really important. And I can do that in a way that, you know, if it were third person, I would just be like a journalist, and I would be separate from it, right?
Right. I feel like this also brings up some question of interiority versus exteriority, and going back to this idea of the archive, as you were talking about in Wunderkammer, that book feels very enclosed. Like we have the same attention to objects maybe, but
Mm-hmm.
in that book they're very contained. It's enclosed, whereas I was wondering if you felt like How the End Begins sort of goes to a more exterior place.
Right. I think that actually, this goes back to the way that the books interact. I think that after Wunderkammer, I just feel like I'm done with that. And How the End Begins is sort of the smashing of all of that. And there actually is a lot of smashing and violence in the book. And the idea, also at the end of How the End Begins, there's a poem that talks about letting go of this sort of mask or persona, this thing that I was taught, this idea of sort of protecting oneself in the poem with certain devices. And the book that I wrote over the summer, I think, well, actually all the books coming after this are really it's almost like what's left after you smash it. So Dregs really is just these tiny little poems that are like fragments. And then it kind of goes out from that. So it really is this, because what happened is I realized, I think we were talking about this earlier, that the way that I had been trained and the way that I had internalized the idea of great poetry was that it's poetry with the perfect line and the perfect stanza and the perfect enjambment and, it's this sort of perfect thing, which I think Wunderkammer is sort of playing with. And then I realized that the very things I'm trying to write about, they can't be said with that kind of perfect or that aim at perfection. And in fact, aiming for perfection is part of the problem for me. And so How the End Begins is sort of the beginning of the end of that, if that makes any sense, and the beginning of something different. I don't know if that answers your question,
Yeah,
but
I
it
think
says
it does.
something.
And I think it's interesting to bring up form as like the field on which this is playing out, because to me it seems like How the End Begins is very attentive to form. It kind of goes back to these couplets and tercets and very considered line breaks, things like that. I don't know, how do you think about form?
Right, so the funny thing is that I actually gave a talk when I had this realization, I was preparing for a talk last spring. It was on Tori Dent's HIV Mon Amour and about the archive, and I was so nervous about the talk and getting the talk right, and then I realized that was the problem. That makes any sense, and that is, of course, part of writing the poetry, is trying to write the perfect poem, and I realized that trying to have the perfect line and all that stuff is part of the problem, but still I do it. I mean, that's where I come from, right? And so even when I'm talking about breaking that, it's not completely broken. But I also want to say that it seems that for a while now, there are now poems where, the poems are just sort of all over the page. There's this kind of break with form, and it's a new kind of sort of avant-garde form, but it doesn't seem to actually enact or perform what it's trying to do. And so I'm trying to get closer to that. So the solution to me isn't just to not, any form I have is still form. It's not to just all of a sudden decide I'm a language poet. That doesn't make any sense either. So part of my, what I was writing my thesis on and what I'm working on now is how to create a new language. And I can think about it and talk about it, but I'm just like slightly incrementally getting there, as you say. Like, it's not
Right.
I'm just moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think one of my experiences with reading this work is, in terms of making that new language, is playing with pacing. So just looking at those poems on the page, the short lines, the couplets, the tercets, it seems like they should read very quickly, but I found the opposite effect happening, where it was like almost this drugged effect.
Right.
Yeah, so were you thinking about pacing as well, or slowness?
I think that I wasn't thinking about that, but I know that sound and rhythm and speed are all sort of organic to the poem itself. That makes sense. So that does make complete sense. But I didn't think when I put together the book, this is what I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, one of my main, I think I just said this, but one of my main concerns, and this is what I think of when I'm teaching too, is that every poem has its own set of rules. And that if every one of us is entirely different, which I believe we're all similar, but we're all entirely different, then I can't take other rules from other poems and put them onto my own work, right? And so I'm trying to figure out what language and how I can use space and form for this specific poem in that specific book. And it's going to be different than anything else and different than anybody else should do. And that's what I was getting at before, this idea that all of a sudden, if I'm going to not use form anymore, I would just, like put all the words, like all over the page. That's actually not my form. That's whoever's form who already did that. And that actually doesn't make sense to me. But it would make complete sense that it would be slow and sort of druggy in that book for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think even thinking about the time scales on which this book is operating, it's sort of taking this moment of just the very beginning of the end and sort of blowing up that moment or slowing down. Right. I've had conversations where we have talked about this book as sort of filmic.
Right.
Movement.
I was just thinking actually that that one of the things I thought about a lot is this one, this one moment in Melancholia where the horses are dropping, and when the horse falls, like that's the end, right? And so it is this slow-mo, very small thing, and I think that is what I was thinking about a lot. And there are a lot of film references in here, and in the poems I actually talk about the poem being a film, so I think that's completely right. And I'm very interested in each line being like a slide, if that makes sense. I mean, people don't use slides anymore, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And this idea of montage, maybe, like accumulation of images, but also like we could think about it's the root of like monster, how there's something monstrous about this showing, this revealing.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, for sure the montage though, and the thing that I'm also very interested in right now is montage, but also what happens when you put two photos next to each other, and that there's a space between, right? Space between the slides, or when they make a montage or montage film, there's a space between that is never articulated, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm also not interested in explaining everything, because I think that what needs to be said is often not said. It has to be sort of kept in the in-between, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's a risk, I realize. Puts me in trouble.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think there is this movement especially in the most recent book, of like approaching and then turning away at the last moment. This gesture of moving toward and then turning away. If that makes sense.
No, it does.
Yeah.
I had this experience with one of my students at Sarah Lawrence. I feel like I shouldn't say this, but oh well. I just did anyway, and we meet in conferences, and she wanted to tell me something, and I had encouraged that she do a scrapbook, and she just sort of slightly moved over and did her hand like that, so I knew she was pointing toward her scrapbook, and there were photos that she put together in this kind of collage, which I had encouraged, that then illuminated something that I hadn't known, that she couldn't speak, she couldn't say it, and it was this moment, and it was so beautiful, and I felt so honored that she would sort of tell me that, but she couldn't tell me that, and I think that that's part of it too, is that what cannot be said can only be referred to, or has to stay within the sort of chasm between, or can be portrayed in an image, but it cannot be explained because there isn't a language for it, and so there's something about that. But I realize when I do that it can be misunderstood, right? That's the thing with the poems, is that they may not be understood.
Yeah. that sort of brings me to a question about language itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so your first language, you grew up speaking German, is that right?
Right.
So how do you feel like that has affected your poetics in terms of
Right.
maybe thinking about translation or meaning or being understood, or the refusal of silence?
Right. No, it's a really great question. I remember I remember thinking about that. But so my first year, it depends on who I talk to. Either I was in Germany the first 3 months or the first like 9 to 12 months of my life. And I don't know if you get language that early, but I would have been surrounded by this language. And then in preschool, I was in German preschool. My dad was never home because he was always working, and my mom was very young. She's German, so she would have been speaking German at home. But so I think about that. My dad's first language was Spanish, but he didn't speak Spanish at home because he had completely assimilated, thinking that that would help us. So there's like that giant hole there. And the idea that both my parents, their first language was another language, but my dad couldn't speak his language, and then my mom could or couldn't, I'm not sure. So I don't actually know, but I do know, and I think this is related, that the first 3 years in school I didn't speak, and I got into a lot of trouble, as you can imagine. In first grade, I remember getting in a lot of trouble because the teacher was saying, like, why can't you talk? And so I think that there's something about that, the different languages at home and how my parents were trying to speak another language, and how we picked that up, I'm not sure. I imagine we picked it up in fragments. And then I also imagine my mom's English, at the time she learned English, it was British English. So I imagine when I spoke English, it was this weird English in school, right? It wasn't American English, because that's not what I was getting. So so there's that, but I also think that the way that I think is actually in these slides. I mean, in these sort of Aspergian, like, I think that the way that I think is in images. I remember meeting with a student at Sarah Lawrence once, and she was asking, how does one make a metaphor? And I was shocked. I thought we all knew, right? And I didn't realize I had to teach her how to do a metaphor, but I did. And that's when I realized that that's just the way that I always think. So it's automatic for me to sort of like point to something and think that everyone knows what I mean, but they don't. And so I think there's sort of a, like, all those places meet together, there's a, yeah, I could talk about the language thing forever, but I won't.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really fascinating. And I love this idea of thinking in slides and thinking of the slide as a technology, as something that moves.
Right,
And I was,
right.
yeah, I was thinking about translation in that sense as well, just the fact of, like, the geometric moving one thing to another place.
Right,
And
right.
even in these books, there are things that move from one book to another, or
Right.
Yeah, I had an example, but I don't remember what it was. Maybe it was like taking that Bachman title, the Todesarten, and then turning that into
exactly.
Death the
Yeah.
Project or something like
Right.
that.
No, that's really interesting, and it's funny because it's not literal. So if anybody were to ask me, and they do, what is the relation between that title exactly with the poem?
Mhm.
It's not. That's not
Yeah.
the way it is. It's this kind of just informing kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
But I think going back to one of the earlier questions about why am I writing so much, and I'm actually not writing that much, but I think that is, in a way, that is my first language. It's kind of I actually just recently realized that when I'm in the class, I raise my hand. I'm in school, I raise my hand, and I'll say something, and everyone just kind of scratches their head and they just go forward. And then a little bit later, somebody else will say the same thing, but they'll conceptualize it. They'll say this whole thing in like 2 paragraphs, whereas I said it in this kind of like 7 slides. Why don't you get it? Kind of a thing. And so I think that that's actually the way that I think. It's like a Morse code or something, and so it would make complete sense to kind of like scratch all these things out. The other thing is that and I've said this a lot, is that it's also like a machine. Like, I don't understand many things. Like, I don't understand a lot of things, but when I write a poem, it's a way of trying to figure it out, and I never usually get there, but it's like a machine that helps me get there. And so I think that in those ways, poetry is like a survival tactic. It's like a little machine that helps me in a way, like translate myself in a way, right?
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it is interesting because there are machines everywhere in these poems, even like
Right.
these little recording devices or projection or the music box.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are just so many things that I find compelling about these poems. And to go back to maybe Lars von Trier a little bit as a muse, or how the end begins feels like a constellation of muses, maybe with Melancholia and Bachman and Thomas Bernhard, Jean Genet, Plath, obviously, Dickinson. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about how those sources came into this book, or like were you specifically thinking of all those things as you started writing it?
I think as I was writing it, certainly Bachman, Bernard, Melancholia, I should just say that I think Lars von Trier is a very interesting filmmaker, but I don't love most of his films. They're actually too much for me, but Melancholia I think is a perfect film. And then Genet for sure. There's actually a lot of people. I'm giving a talk later with a slideshow that has some of those people, Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach and different people. And they are sort of muses. I mean, I think that's the thing, is that Bernard and Bachman and Genet do actually show up in there, and so does Melancholia. But some of the people I'm thinking of, they don't actually make their way in there. But in a way, knowing they existed, and then I guess in a way relating to their lives and feeling like their guides helped me write the book. And I also think there's something really great about actually including those people in the work. And I know it's a little, I don't think it's very popular right now, because there's this whole idea like I'm just a genius, I made this book, but actually without those people I wouldn't have made this book. And I think there's just something about that that's nice, that they're there with me. And I think also that that film Melancholia shows up throughout the book, and I think the way that it was made, and the fact that it works in different levels, it's both a chronicle of a woman suffering from either bipolar or depression, or it's about the end of the world, which may not be two planets, but it might be something else, that they can coexist at the same time, and that there, even within that, there are other stories that are occurring. And so to me, that's sort of a great template. And I was thinking about that the personal does coexist with the larger cultural.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I could talk about Melancholia all day, but I'll restrain myself. Just that I think one connection that I see really strongly is this idea of refusal, and Justine's like affect as a refusal.
Right. No, exactly.
Even refusing futurity, refusing the...
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's one of the great things too. And it's funny because when the film came out, I knew people who couldn't get through, like even like the first 15 minutes. They got so angry, and they were very angry at that character. It was interesting, and it I thought illuminated also our reaction toward people who don't kind of get with it and just get self-help books and get a grip. But also with depression, like just get out of bed. People kept saying it was so indulgent. Why didn't she just do the wedding? And so they missed the whole point entirely, right? But that exactly is that she's the crazy one, but she's the one who actually sees things as they are, right? and she's trying, and I think that's what's also very interesting. She's trying and she can't do it. And I also, I mean, I won't. I could talk about it forever, but I won't.
Yeah, and maybe this is related, but thinking about the concept of repetition, how melancholia refuses a type of repetition, maybe, or maybe not. But I do feel like there is a lot of repetition structurally in the icons that recur in your latest book, especially.
Oh, right. Right.
And certainly, you were saying that Wunderkammer is about trauma, and so that idea of repetition makes a lot of sense. But I was also thinking about this Douglas Kearney, what he said about the loop. He says the loop is a circle that accumulates. The climax could be the accumulated weight of the repetition, and the weight revises the repetition even without changing its components. So I guess I just wanted to put those two models out there and see if you feel like you connect with either one, or if there's a different way that you conceptualize the repetition.
Right, no, it's a great question. That's a great quote. But I was just trying to think, what is that? I mean, I know one thing is that so repetition underlines something, so if something's repeated, but also it negates it. So if something shows up once, it's there, and if it shows up the second time, it sort of gets negated. And I think that's interesting too. There's this kind of this thing that happens, but the accumulation is also something I'm very interested in, the idea of having something appear, especially if the reader doesn't necessarily notice it as until the accumulation occurs. That's really interesting to me too. And then compulsive repetition is actually something I write about a lot. This idea of like doing the same thing over and over, right, and not knowing that you're doing it, trying to figure it out, which one could say that's what the act of writing is too, right? So
yeah. There's that line from your book, I repeat what I cannot bear, chronic repetition, which is
this
fascinating.
idea of doing something and you can't stop doing it, but you have to get the solution to it, right? And I think that's interesting. And that's the other thing too, is the I can't say the word, the enacting that occurs. And again, that can be misunderstood as that's just something I'm doing, and so therefore I'm neurotic or something, but that there are things that are occurring with the different characters and with the writing that are enacting things that I'm interested in. That doesn't necessarily mean literally, right, whatever. I don't, whatever. That a lot of times it's conceptual.
Yeah. And going back to our discussion of the use of the I often frequently feels very highly staged, very performative.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think especially with the last two books, it's like a character performing these things for to bring them about in a way. And the funny thing about the poems I wrote this summer is that it really is me writing about the performing of the different things. So many of the poems say myself as for example, myself as Kirsten Dunst playing this one character, and so it starts to strip away some of that so that you can see that the whole thing is a performance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, I think we're in this like misuse of how people misuse the confessional, that if you read Sylvia Plath as purely confessional, it's boring. It's not interesting, or not as interesting, by reducing it to mere confession.
Right, but I think what's interesting about that is that, so I always think to myself, like, why would somebody do that? and why would somebody do that with her work and not, for example, one of the other confessional poets, like Berryman, for example. So I think part of the whole confessional is that it's tied to the feminine, and that being feminine is vulnerable, and so as a result, female poets often then write in a less feminine way, I think, because it's less risky.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think I was talking to you earlier about Lana Del Rey a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what's interesting about her to me, this way that she does perform this ultra feminine, like emphasized femininity, but the reception to that, I think, is really variable. I think a lot of people almost read her as confessional, or they're like unwilling to see the persona that's enacting these things.
Yeah, I guess I'm not that familiar with her work, but it's interesting because when you said that, it made me wonder who sees it and who doesn't, and maybe that's actually more interesting. Is maybe it matters less who's going to be reductive. Like maybe that just doesn't matter. Do you know? I was thinking of this, and this is very weird, but there's this really great essay Ted Hughes wrote about Sylvia Plath's poem "Sheep and Fog." Right? It's weird. It's Ted Hughes. But it's a poem she wrote after Ariel, and she was trying to use the same language and the same motifs from Ariel, and Ariel is very muscular and it's very energetic, and it ends before he screwed up with it. Like, it ends very happy and triumphantly, but the poem wasn't that at all. And she was rewriting this poem, and she kept trying to put pieces of, like, she kept trying to put babies in this poem and chariots and gold, and she kept trying to feed it all this stuff to make it something different, and she kept revising it, and it's like she kept trying to get her will in it. And finally, when she was able to see the poem for what it was, which is doom, right? I mean, this was her own death coming. Then the poem became what it is, and it's this beautiful poem.
Yeah.
But to me, that just registers again that that's not confessional. That is a completely artificial work of art that she was constructing. It is not coming from a diary entry, right? And it's this whole other level of making something, right? Where you completely give yourself up, you sacrifice yourself for this other thing, which is not actually you at all, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm also thinking of some of the ways that the personas in your books are often in masquerading, or dressing up as something else, or in drag almost.
Right.
Just like playing with this stability of the persona that's being presented, maybe. I'm not sure if I had a question. I think for me, it just goes back to these ideas about like artifice, disguise, performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a weird way, and this goes more to the personal, is I've always felt like, like my sister or my mom, whenever they leave the house, they have to put all this makeup on, and it's not necessarily even to, what am I trying to say? I don't know. They're very feminine, and they do these things, and that always seemed very strange to me. When I do that, it is very much drag. So then if I'm going to wear makeup and all that stuff, it does feel like the same thing as if my husband were doing it. Like, it feels completely separate. And so in a weird way, then I'm like a blank slate that I can then, then I can put any costume or drag on to perform any of the characters. If that makes any sense. It's like a tabula rasa or something.
Sure. Yeah, and it's always, not always, but frequently played out through this figure of the girl, which is really interesting to me. I don't know if you have anything to say about like how girlhood plays into these ideas.
Right. I mean, I could talk forever about that.
Yeah.
But one of the things that recurs throughout my books is women and girls and anorexia specifically. And I really think from my own experience and research and talking to different women, I know that it is a form of resistance. It is a way of saying, I don't want part of this ultra consumerist culture. I don't want to do this. And oftentimes it actually is, I don't want this feminine drag. And so it's interesting that the rehabilitation, I was actually in an eating disorder unit, and once we got to a certain point, once we had gained enough weight, we went on this weird excursion to New Jersey, to this mall, to Neiman Marcus, and we tried on gowns. And I've tried to write that essay and cannot get that thing published, but I just feel like it really is part of the rehabilitation for women, is that, you know, to be perfectly healthy is to eat, but only weigh a certain amount, but it is to be this, to perform this feminine, whatever, female character.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it's very strange. I think it's very strange. And I've never heard anybody write about it before. But so those are the things that I think about, and I don't think that anorexia is conforming. Actually, I think it's the opposite, like the true mental disorder. And that's the thing, is it's called a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So then it really can't be something that, the way people talk about it is like it can just be picked up. But if it's a mental illness, it can't be picked up. That's a whole other, right? That's a whole other
Yeah,
thing. I'm
yeah.
not sure, because I think it's culturally related too.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Well,
complicated.
I can't wait for that essay. I feel like it does
Right.
need to be in the world.
Yeah.
I think we may be getting toward the end.
Okay.
But I was wondering if you might be willing to read a poem for us.
Sure. Do you have one in mind?
I have lots of things in mind, but I'm not sure. I have so many favorites in this book, but maybe the Hinge, because I like
Oh, yeah.
I like how
Good
it
one.
sort of hinges the book. How it
Right,
seems
right,
like
right.
a transition.
Okay, that's a good one. And it's a funny one too. Not everyone gets it though. So this is called The Hinge. My brother is still alive and living in Fresno. All day he stares at the dead bodies of automobiles in his garage. It isn't a prison he would wish himself free of. I visit him, dragging my boxes of books and awards behind me. We're walking out of the city into the white flame of the desert. Not unlike the desert fathers walking out into Sinai. My brother carries his briefcase loaded in icons and dollar bills. He is wearing Larry Levis's shining suit and black leather boots. I'm wearing a pale gown of sun-bleached flowers. We are talking about the resurrection. We are walking dead into it, leaving the world and its sweet chorus of horrors behind. There is no city but the city within, no door but the door to simple wisdom. We walk dumb as newborns into the tremendous and endless blessing. Thank you
Yeah, thank
for
you.
asking me to read that.
Is there anything we should know about for upcoming stuff? You're working on a book of essays.
Right, so the book of essays will be coming out in 2018, and the
Okay.
main topic there is silence in the work of writers and artists, and resistance. And then Dregs will be out in 2018 also.
Great. I'm looking forward to reading those.
Thanks.
And I just want to thank you again for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you so much.
And thank you.